Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus on benchmark CG 4.1, explain the relationship between U.S. foreign and domestic policy. In Part 1, we focus on domestic and foreign policy issues. Focusing on benchmark clarification 1, students will recognize the difference between domestic and foreign policy. And focusing on benchmark clarification 2, students will identify issues that relate to U.S. domestic and foreign policy. What is the difference between domestic and foreign policy, and what are some of the factors that relate to domestic and foreign policy? First, let's focus on the difference between domestic and foreign policy. Domestic policy is the nation's plan for making laws and policies that affect people in the United States, including jobs, healthcare, and education. Foreign policy is the nation's overall plan for dealing with other nations, including a plan for diplomacy, alliances, trade, and defense. We will now focus on 3 domestic policy examples. The Social Security Act was enacted to establish to help the elderly by providing them with a monthly income after reaching retirement age. Medicare, about 30 years later, was established to help the poor pay for medical care and medicine that they need and often cannot afford. Medicare was intended to support both the poor and the elderly. Notice how the 30-year gap between the Social Security Act and Medicare demonstrates that after a short period of time, it became clear that people receiving a monthly income after reaching retirement age did not have enough money to cover their medical costs, nor did the poor have enough money to cover their medical costs. And consequently, one way to address this concern was to enact Medicare. The No Child Left Behind Act was established in 2001. This law established to change education standards and create new tests to measure student achievement. What about foreign policy goals? Foreign policy goals include national security by keeping the nation safe, especially borders, promoting peace by creating alliances with other nations, spreading democracy by promoting democratic government, promoting international trade by buying and selling goods, and providing foreign aid to countries in need. So you can see that all of the issues that are raised on this slide would affect people equally. Everyone benefits from national security. Everyone benefits by promoting peace and spreading democracy and having more opportunities to buy and sell goods than fewer. And also to look at other countries that are in need and look at the reasons why it would be helpful to help those countries in need through foreign aid. Here we're going to be looking at a political cartoon focusing on the relationship between domestic and foreign policy. Look at this person's shirt. This person's shirt says USA. Notice that they're wearing a blindfold and the word above their head is hostage. The idea of this political cartoon is that the United States is being held hostage because the United States depends on foreign oil in order for people to have enough gas to drive their cars. So here's somebody who is trapped, right? The gas pump hose is not only around this person's body, but it's tied around this person's body in a way that the person cannot use their hands, so they're powerless to use their hands. They're blindfolded so they cannot see, and because their hands are tied behind their back, they can't remove the blindfold, which means they really are powerless. And look at the message on the side of the gas pump. It says, United States government, failure to end dependence on foreign oil. And so the message of the political cartoon is that the United States is depending on foreign oil in order to run its domestic economy, right? That people need cars in order to get from place to place. People need to put gas in buses and boats and other means of transportation. And because of this dependence, this means that we must deal with other countries, and they're going to deal with us the way that they want to. So our foreign policy then affects our domestic policy. Here we have a photograph of U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. And Antony Blinken is someone who represents the United States when conducting foreign policy. As Secretary of State, he is the head of the State Department. And one of the reasons that I identified this particular photograph is because of the images behind Secretary Blinken. The images behind Secretary Blinken include both United States flags and Department of State flags. We can see that the two flags, one on the very right and one second to the left, we can see the word state appear at the bottom of the circle of those flags. And yet interspersed with those flags is American flags. And in essence, what Secretary Blinken is doing is he is representing, he is speaking for the United States as head of the Department of State, and the message is pretty clear that the way that the Department of State conducts himself as Secretary of State, representing the department, is to best serve the United States interests when representing the United States in its foreign policy, whether Secretary Blinken is appearing abroad or is making statements in the United States to other public officials or to the public. So these are some interesting messages showing the interrelationship between domestic and foreign policy. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. If you still have questions, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.